J'ai le plaisir de vous introduire cet après-midi Katie Laferty, qui est la directrice exécutive pour le Centre de la récupération des accidents cérébrovasculaires, Fondation des maladies du cœur et de l'accident vasculaire cérébral. Avant de se joindre à cette organisation de la Fondation des maladies du cœur et des accidents vasculaires cérébraux en avril 2013, Katie avait occupé pendant 12 ans le poste de directrice exécutive, fondatrice du Réseau canadien contre les accidents cérébrovasculaires, organisme sans but lucratif financé par le programme des réseaux des centres d'excellence dont la mission est de limiter les conséquences des AVC sur les Canadiens. En plus de la supervision des activités de recherche, de formation, d'application des connaissances et de gestion du RCAC, Cathy a guidé le réseau dans la mise en œuvre de la stratégie canadienne de la RCAC en 2003, le renouvellement de l'augmentation du financement fédéral en 2005 et le tout premier congrès canadien des accidents vasculaires cérébraux en 2010. Suivi de 3 autres congrès. Oh no, I'm in the English section now. Elle est membre de plusieurs conseils d'administration, dont le réseau de recherche en santé des enfants et des mères. Elle est titulaire d'un baccalauréat en biologie et l'Université de Queens et une maîtrise en administration de l'Université de Carnegie Mellon à Pittsburgh, en Pennsylvanie. En 2010, l'Ottawa Business Journal a désigné Katie comme une des 40 personnalités de moins de 40 ans ayant les plus d'influence d'Ottawa pour ses contributions au secteur de la santé. Katie Laferty is Executive Director of the Heart and Stroke Foundation Center for Stroke Recovery. Prior to joining HSC and CSR in April 2013, Katie served for 12 years as the founding Executive Director of the Canadian Stroke Network, a nonprofit entity funded by the Network of Centers of Excellence program with a focus on reducing the impact of stroke on Canadians. In addition to overseeing the research, training, knowledge transition, and management operation of the CSN, Katie led the CSN through its inception of the Canadian Stroke Strategy in 2003, a successful renewal and increase of federal funding in 2005, and the inaugural Canadian Stroke Congress of 2010, followed by 3 subsequent congresses. Katie is a member of a number of boards, including the Maternal, Infant, Youth, and Research Network. She holds a BSc in biology from Queen's University and an MBA from Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. In 2010, Katie was recognized by the Ottawa Business Journal as one of Ottawa's top 40 under 40 for her contribution to the health sector. Ladies and gentlemen, Katie Laferty.
Thank you. It's always daunting when that top 40 thing is mentioned because I know everybody's doing the math in their head. How old am I? I'm sorry for taking valuable time away from you because honestly what you're doing is so interesting and fascinating to me as an outside observer, and I'm just thrilled with the innovation that I'm hearing, the ideas that I'm hearing, and I hope that I can, through telling the story of what we went through with the Stroke Network, give you perhaps some ideas on how you might want to shape things, things that might be relevant in your context, and also just some lessons learned in terms of, you know, how you can hit the ground running with some of these great ideas, because we had the luxury of time with our network. We had 2 cycles of 7 years of funding, and during that time we had to have an impact. You're going to have 5 years in which to make an impact, and you're really going to need to leverage people like me and from other networks who've been there and done that and have made mistakes along the way and also figured out how to do things a little bit better. So hopefully I can convey some of that today. So the Canadian Stroke Network had a very noble vision, but really what drove us was the need to make an impact. And we would say that almost daily. You know, does this have an impact? Will this make an impact? That was kind of our mantra in the network. We had a few areas that we focused on, like every network of centers of excellence did. One was research excellence, collaboration, etc. The other was capacity generation, and the third was a really cumbersome term that the federal government seems to like, which is knowledge exploitation. But to me, that was always making a difference. How do we make a difference with what we're doing? And then obviously enabling these three areas of focus for us was networking and solid management. So hopefully as I walk through this, you'll see a little bit of our evolution in thinking. I'll talk a little bit about each of these three areas, but I'm going to spend the most time talking about the knowledge exploitation, which became for us the Canadian stroke strategy, because I think that's probably the most in line with what we're trying to do here. So in terms of research, just some lessons learned from our experience. Obviously, we were focusing on different research questions, and we had things organized into major themes of research. But we found very early on that you do have to be strategic, and to some of the discussions that have been happening today about how much do we focus, how broad should we be, I mean, that's the age-old question. And what we found in the network was, after funding people for a couple of years in our early days, we were probably funding, I would say, about 60 or 70 principal investigators. We quickly realized that that strategy was not going to differentiate us as a network, and if we continued to do this, when we came up for renewal, the expert panel would look at us and say, why are you doing anything different than what CIHR does? And, why are you here? So we very quickly stopped and we said, okay, people get together, think of a handful of bigger impact, larger scale projects that will actually make a difference. And we adjusted our review criteria to reflect that. So we didn't look at projects based on solely research excellence. We also added a criteria of strategic fit, which meant a lot of things. And eventually it came to mean whether or not it was going to feed into our efforts that we were embarking on with the Canadian stroke strategy. We also found early on that you had to be very hands-on from a management team perspective, because literally in the early days of the network, there were meetings where we would have physiatrists and occupational therapists almost in fist fights around the table, arguing about the important research questions and how to do this research, and literally very hostile conversations. And we'd already been funded. So I wish I was here for the next 2 days. What you have to do is really get into the issues. Somebody needs to be there objectively. For us, it was the management team, thinking about what are the questions that will unite. And you have to hone in on those very early on, because otherwise it's very, very destructive. You need to be responsive. We always reserve some of our research funding so that we could be flexible and respond. So if some new idea, some new collaboration, some networking opportunity came down the road, we were able to respond. So don't lock everything in. Think about setting some aside when you're doing the budgeting. Obviously, you need to minimize conflicts of interest. I could actually do a whole presentation on that topic. It sounds so trivial and obvious, but how you set up your internal processes, your reviews, who's going to be on your internal steering committee is very, very important. And conflict of interest abounds in Canada, where we have very tight communities. So we have to manage that. And then obviously this whole thing is about the end user. That's a very jargony term for remember who you're doing this for and make sure that they are the center of what you're doing. For us, that meant involving stroke survivors and caregivers at our board level, at our planning and priorities committee level, actually having them part of our annual meeting. And as I heard Justin this morning, I thought, wow, the first annual meeting of this network should be done in conjunction with part 2 of the youth meeting, And they should all be together. Maybe not all the sessions will be together, but some of them should be together. Because that's an incredibly powerful group that you have if used properly by the network. Capacity generation, I'm going to skip over this because this is really not a focus, I think, of TRAM. But I will say that if you are contemplating, funding any trainees, et cetera, through your research program, this is a really easy area to get partnerships in. I've found over time that people grasp this concept, organizations grasp this concept. It's a win-win. They'll put in some matching dollars. So just keep that in mind as you're going out there trying to build partnerships, that this is an easy one to convince people to participate in. I put empower the trainees early, and I would switch this in this context to empower the youth in Justin's group early. We found that with us, we probably waited too late to do this actually. It wasn't probably until year 6 or 7 where we seriously thought about, all these young people that are participating on these projects and, what are we going to do with them? So they actually self-motivated and came to us and said, we want to be a trainee association. Will you support us? Will you help us? And they started organizing trainee days and workshops and mentoring events, and we really didn't have to do much other than help them a little bit, organize some of this. So the earlier you can get young people involved in these networks, the better. So knowledge exploitation, this will be really kind of the rest of my talk today. So for us, we struggled with this because I think, like most networks, you think about the great research that's going on and you think, well, how am I going to take that research and turn it into something in terms of a new practice, a new drug, a new therapy, whatever. And we struggled a lot with that in the early days of the network. We actually wasted a lot of time in the first 3 or 4 years trying to think about how are we going to do this. And then we realized that it's not about our research that we're doing. It's all important research. They're important questions to answer. We took a step back and we said, forget about the networks of centers of excellence. Forget about what they want us to do. Forget about all their criteria and lists and check boxes and everything. And we just said, what actually needs to happen in Canada? If we want to have an impact, what needs to happen? And let's not hold any boundaries. Let's not limit our thinking in any way. And out of that question came really our big idea that really did address the gaps that are out there and that required somebody to do something. And that was this concept of the Canadian stroke strategy. And really that came from us acknowledging that there was a huge gap in practice compared to what the research evidence was saying. And that was true in the prevention of stroke, in the acute treatment of stroke, in the rehab and recovery from stroke, right across the board and across the entire continuum. The easy statistic that I like to quote, when the stroke network first came into being, there were major city centers in Canada where only 2% of eligible patients were receiving TPA, the clot-busting drug, something that could potentially, if administered in a timely fashion, allow them to walk away with minimal effects from their stroke. And only 2% in major city centers were getting this, far below international standards. So we saw these gaps, and I could give you about 20 statistics like that. They were out there, and we just said, we have to change the healthcare system. That's it. We have to do it. At that point, I remember our scientific director, Tony Hakim, saying, we can't change the healthcare system. There's no way we can do that. We're an NCE. We're supposed to be doing research. That's it. And we all talked about it, and we talked a little more, and we said, if we don't do this, who's going to do it? I mean, really, who's going to do this? And we went to our partners, the Heart and Stroke Foundation, and we said, you know, we're thinking of doing this, but we can't do it alone. You need to be hand in hand with us. We're a team of 6 people in Ottawa. And they said, okay, all right, we'll help you. Let's do this together. And that is where the Canadian Stroke Strategy was born. And we broke the mold of what an NCE was supposed to be, what it's supposed to be doing, and the boundaries on an NCE. And it took a little bit of education on the NCE front. We had to coach them along a little bit. But in the end, it was the compelling story that caused us to get renewed when the other networks in our cycle got cut, and also get an increase in our funding, making us the highest funded network in the NCE program of that time. So what was the Canadian Stroke Strategy? Basically, it was simple. It was this little sketch that we did on a little piece of paper, and that stood the test of time. We didn't have complicated logic models and diagrams and arrows and everything. It was just this, and we said there's really got to be change at 2 levels. The first is obviously where the rubber hits the road at the provincial level. We needed to see the implementation of best practices across the continuum of stroke. And at a national level, we said instead of, you know, steering the ship at a national level like most disease-based strategies do, we're just going to support the provinces so that they don't have to reinvent things 10 times over. Things that we know are better done in common rather than separately. So those things included an emphasis on public awareness, and that was really the Heart and Stroke Foundation taking ownership of that. Best practices and standards of care, that became a huge push for us. I'd encourage you, if you're interested in that in your network, to look at our best practices online. They're quite something. They have associated performance measures with all the best practices. They've been adopted by the World Stroke Organization as the international best practices. And we've developed a number of guides that go with those best practices. So things that can be used by clinicians, but also things that can be used by patients. So we have a patient's guide to the best practices in stroke care so that they can, you know, in common lay language, see what kind of care they should be getting. Professional development, again, another big push for us. This became, for us, the Canadian Stroke Congress. And when we started that, there was no real professional meeting place for people across disciplines who are interested in stroke. And when we started it in 2010, we thought, wow, it'd be really great if we could get, you know, 400 or 500 people out. This would be amazing. And that year, our first year at this, we actually had 1,000 people show up. And each year we've been getting a little bit more. So it just goes to show you the demand that was out there for professional education and information. And it's ended up being kind of our conduit for the great research that's coming out, and also some of the learnings and sharing knowledge related to the stroke strategy. And then information and evaluation, one of the things we did there was we issued a report card, for lack of a better word. We didn't call it that because there's sensitivities associated with that, but we put out a report called The Quality of Stroke Care in Canada in 2011. And that had huge impact. The provinces were able to actually use that information as a benchmark. And before the Stroke Network sunsets in another year, they'll be issuing a follow-up report to that. And then finally, coordinated research. Once we came up with this concept of the stroke strategy, it actually gave our research a lot more purpose, because all of a sudden there was this whole machine of, you know, hundreds of people that were volunteering and mobilized across the country to accept, you know, research, and also to inform the researchers and what questions they needed answered. So some of the things that we did, I've talked a little bit about some of these, the best practices at the national level, the Quality of Stroke Care Report, an economic analysis. We actually spent quite a bit of money doing an in-depth economic analysis on the impact of organized stroke care in Canada. And that actually served us very well in terms of some of the work we were doing in the provinces and having them actually implement provincial changes. I've talked about the Canadian Stroke Congress, and one of our recent pushes was in the area of telestroke, and we actually helped fund seed funding for telestroke implementation in some of the provinces. At a provincial level, you'll see that a number of the provinces committed to various forms of improvements in stroke care, and some of them have made ongoing base budget commitments to organize stroke care within their provinces. And it seems simple, but so much of the work of the stroke strategy was at this level, at the provincial level, because we literally had, as I said, hundreds of people across the country that were mobilized and organized in the provinces pushing for improved care and the implementation of best practices. And this resulted in new stroke units being put in place, secondary stroke prevention clinics being put in place, new emergency protocols for stroke being put in place, and enhanced rehab services and early supported discharge. So these are tangible changes. We actually changed the system. So how we did it, this is just kind of my little guide to how we went about doing this. This is kind of the insiders, the e-Hollywood true story of how we went about actually developing the stroke strategy, because once you see it all on paper, it seems really straightforward, but it wasn't straightforward. So first of all, it started with the idea, that little chart on a piece of paper, but we needed an example of how it could work in order to convince people that this actually could work. Luckily, Ontario had started putting in place organized stroke care within their province. So we had a template, a model to work with, which was very, very important in the early days. But it allowed us to say, you know, every province in Canada should be doing what Ontario is doing. And we started small. We got buy-in. I mean, getting buy-in in those early days was quite a challenge. I told you about the Heart and Stroke Foundation, but a key thing was convening a summit. And we convened 2 of these, and these included stroke survivors, but also some health administrators, some people of influence in the field of stroke, some people who had had success implementing large national strategies in the past. I remember we had John Wade, a former Deputy Minister of Health. And what we did in those summits was really kind of chew on the idea, the concept. So that diagram with some description, and we kind of picked it apart and said, how would this change? What would we do? The fortunate thing in stroke was the gaps were so obvious, what needed to be done was so obvious, that we very quickly came to consensus. I know from talking to people involved in the cancer strategy, it took them, 2 or 3 years just to agree on what the cancer strategy was going to look like. We basically agreed in the stroke community on this concept over the course of 6 months. So that was very fortunate. Then we took on the role of catalyzing, and the network was always very clear that that was our role. We were going to make change happen. We weren't going to necessarily be out there in the field with our 6 people delivering health services. That was not our role. We were going to be change agents. So what we did is we provided some seed funding, not very much, to local heart and stroke foundations, provincial offices, for them to get coordinators in place. Those coordinators then started putting together steering groups within each province. Those steering groups included people from the ministry, people from health authorities, leading clinicians, and also stroke survivors and caregivers. We nurtured our local champions, so the people who were very vocal and advocates we would use often for press, and involve them in a national steering committee. And we forged links. Obviously, this was all about getting to know the provinces, getting to know how decisions were made within the provinces. We then moved on to supporting. So once these provincial stroke strategies were written, once elements of them had started to be implemented, we in earnest took on our role at a national level of support. And we were primarily focused on developing tools, getting things out there. We helped raise awareness through media, and we obviously helped make the case for change. And I think probably the last year or two has really been about sustaining. So the network actually is shutting its doors in a year, which is why I moved on, as did two of my colleagues, to other stroke-related areas. So we thought very hard along the way about how we can keep some of this momentum going. And it became clear that the Heart and Stroke Foundation was going to be much more than just a logo on this effort. They were rising to the challenge, and they were going to take on a lot of what we had started. So we never actually even contemplated becoming a self-sustaining organization or continuing on. Our strategy became, let's nurture our partnerships and have them feel complete ownership over what we're doing so that they can carry on, because they will stand the test of time, those organizations, and they will be able to keep the pressure on and keep change happening. And the tips that we learned along the way is that you have to persevere. I mean, the stroke strategy was difficult. I mean, it was difficult. It was a lot of work, and we had to just stay completely focused and positive that this would work, despite many, many obstacles. We worked with urgency. Part of what I've always liked about these networks is they do have a finite life, and that forces you to focus and get things done. If we had known we were just going to go on forever, you know, we wouldn't have worked with the kind of urgency we did. We stayed very light on admin. Our team was very, very lean, and we worked with what's already there. So in many cases, many, many, more so than the cases where the base budget was committed in a province, there wasn't any new funding for stroke. What they did instead was they reorganized. They just listened to what we were saying. They redid the emergency protocols. They rethought how service was being delivered. And those changes were significant enough, but they didn't require necessarily big dollars. So just to remind you of kind of our whole thing, I'm just going to say a couple of words about the enablers at the bottom, just because you're all going to be putting together LOIs and proposals, and these are obviously going to be elements of what you're putting in. So I'll share just some of my thoughts on those. One of the biggest mistakes that networks make, in my opinion, is to not invest properly in communications. So the first person that I hired once I was brought on board was a director of communications with media experience, connections with all the health reporters, and somebody who could write beautifully. So very important to get that kind of person, whether it's going to be your outreach efforts, your media efforts, your reports, your documents, whatever. You need to have that kind of person on your team. You need to have complementary skills in your management structure. So part of the reason why our team worked so well was because I was very different in my skill set than Tony Hakim. He was the scientific director and the person with the content knowledge, the neurologist. He had incredible credibility on that front. And then I brought the management background. And everybody we brought on was like that. Very important to mix it up on your team. We functioned throughout the most part with about 6 staff on board, so a very lean team. And roughly, when you're looking at admin costs, you can factor about somewhere around $1 million or less in admin costs. That's probably a fair number and typical of most networks. And then the other thing is, the value of the annual meetings. And I've seen annual meetings of some networks that aren't done particularly well, some are done well. For us, the annual meetings were incredibly important in those early days because that is where the researchers started working together. And not only working together, they partied together. And I have to say, it might sound silly, but you know, one of our annual meetings was in St. Andrews, New Brunswick, and we had a lobster cookout down by the beach. We had the Flying Scotsman playing guitar, and we had a bonfire going. And at one point, I looked around the bonfire, and there was David Scott, the chair of our board, very prominent attorney, next to Andrew Demchuk, the lead of the Calgary Stroke Program, next to Dale Corbett, an animal researcher, all having fun and chatting and getting to know each other. And those early interactions were very, very important. I can't stress that enough because those relationships now are rock solid in our community. And we're more competitive as a community because of it. So, on that last note about partying, I'll end my talk there, and I do have time for a few questions if there are any.
Thank you very much for that really stimulating and challenging talk. I'm Howard Goldman. I haven't met everyone. I'm a member of the collaborating selection panel. I wondered, were you funded for 7 years initially, or did you expand 5 years of funding to 7 years because of this experience in the early years of feeling like you were feeling your way around?
Yeah, so...
and at what level were you funded?
Yeah, so our original funding was $4.2 million, and it was for 7 years contingent on a positive midterm review, which we had to do midway through the cycle. And I have to say the midterm review was the eye-opener for us. That's when things changed in our network, because I would say we probably got a C or C minus. And it was kind of like, yeah, you're checking all the boxes, you're doing everything, but, why are you here? Are you doing really anything different than CIHR can do on its own? And that's the question networks always have to ask themselves. Could this be done by anybody else, any other mechanism out there? If the answer is yes, then revisit, because you should not be a network. There needs to be a really clear value proposition. So we made it to that 7-point mark. Then we had to do a full renewal, which was a huge undertaking. The 150-page application, international peer review comes in, we have to present. And that was the point where we had our budget increased and we got funded for a second cycle of 7 years. And we got increased to 6.4 million per year. Per year, yeah.
Got another question here and then in the middle.
Really interesting. How did you determine if you were successful, and did you have hard outcome measures for that?
We did. So in that initial diagram, we had, for each one of those boxes on there, we had some measures associated with them. A lot of them were ones that were dictated to us by the NCE program, and they were the common ones, publications, high impact stuff, but then we came up with some higher level stroke related ones, again, recognizing it's hard to link, obviously, the changes we were going to see in stroke care in Canada with our involvement, but nonetheless, we felt it was important. And so in our renewal application at that 7-year mark, we actually proposed some measures. We had some baseline measures for stroke care, and we said, over the next 7 years, here's what we'd like to see in terms of movement of those. So, and I think that was important for the review panel to see.
You indicated that you had to find a big idea that united.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, did I miss it, or what was the big idea?
For us, it was the stroke strategy. That was our big idea. The whole strategy, yeah, that was it. And, it seemed, I don't think we knew what we were getting into when we got into it. It seemed a lot simpler than it was going to be. And it seemed obvious, but yet you have to think about where the networks were positioned at that time, the NCEs. I mean, they were mainly about basic biomedical, some clinical research, heavy focus on commercialization. That's how they measured that knowledge exploitation piece. So for us, it was a huge risk to take on something like that and to stand in front of that panel at the 7-year mark and say, no, we're not really doing commercialization. Sorry. No, we're making an impact in other ways. This is how we're doing it. But we knew at that time that that was the right thing to do, and nothing ventured, nothing gained. If they were going to cut us, then they were going to cut us. But the commercialization piece was just not going to be there for us, and it's not what Canada needed at that time.
Katie, we've got a couple more questions at least. Are you all right for time? Is that
I think so, yeah.
2 more at least? Yeah. So are you okay with that? Have you got a microphone? Oh, Tony, go on.
You have 2 questions. One, is the Department of Industry that financials the Centers of Excellence?
So yes, they're the directorate that manages it, but the actual funding comes from the 3 granting councils, from CIHR, SSHRC, and NSERC.
Okay, because that might answer my second question, whether TRAM could become a Center of Excellence.
I defer to my colleagues at CIHR, but my guess is if that were to happen, one or the other would have to go. Like CIHR couldn't fund 2 networks, basically.
Wondering whether it was Department of Industry.
Yeah, no. No, unfortunately.
Nice try.
That would be great, though.
Hi, Pat McGorry from Australia. I've got a couple of questions, but actually the first one's, it is a question. I read on the back, I think it was on the back page of Globe and Mail yesterday, that there's a $300 million investment in a new heart and stroke initiative, and just wonder what relationship that has to what you've been talking about. And the second question is, you might have mentioned this, but did you show an improvement in the implementation science aspects of things? Did you show that people had more access as a result of the strategy to those evidence-based treatments that you mentioned at the beginning?
Yes, actually, that's very important to note, because I gave you the bad number without giving you the good number. So just using that TPA number, the same major city centre that I was referring to, which was Ottawa, unfortunately for me, actually increased to, I think, 22 to 23% of patients getting TPA over the course of the stroke strategy. So, and we saw those numbers across the board. I think the overall TPA rate in our quality of stroke care report for Canada was 7%, which is actually higher than most developed countries. So, and we have measures like that across the board. So we did see the improvement we were looking for, which is great. And then your other question, it's not related. That's their regular research investment for the Heart and Stroke Foundation. They're just going about it a slightly different way, partnering long-term with academic institutions.
Okay. I think we have one more, if we may. Great, so last question, please.
I want to thank you, Katie, for being so candid about your experience, because, you know, we learn from mistakes. Just from what you said, you appear to have spent the first few years really kind of fumbling around, if I can say that, before you really struck gold. Have you any advice for the people here about, you know, is it possible to shortcut that fumbling around? What could we do that would accelerate us to the point where we have the big idea?
I don't know if you can shortcut the fumbling around. It's kind of a process. It was interesting. I was saying that to a couple people this morning that, you know, there's lots of research actually on networks and the life cycle of a network and how it evolves. And there is kind of a formative stage in those first couple of years where people have to get to know each other, and you have to weed out. There are people who join the network because they're a big name in the field and they should be part of a network, but yet they don't really see a lot in it for them. They're well funded, it's a lot of work, it's easier to just go and get a grant directly. And those people have to kind of make a choice in that first little bit, whether or not they really see value in the network and want to participate, or just it's not worth their time. And you kind of have to go through that weeding out process and figuring out who's in there for the long term. And also let some young people emerge, because there's kind of under that level of the big names. And I mean, no offense to everybody out here, because there are many big names, but there are, you know, people waiting in the wings that for that stage in their career, getting involved in a leadership role in a network is a big boost, and they put a lot of energy into it and a lot of time, and they have a lot of fresh ideas. So kind of figuring out who's who is just a matter of time, and who has the ideas and where they're going to come from and where the energy is going to come from. So I hope it can be shortcutted, because you only have 5 years, and you will need to hit the ground running. But all I can say is please talk to others who've been there before and done it before. And you know, we're within the networks, certainly the health-related NCEs, we're a pretty tight community. We talk a lot to each other, and we're always here to help. So,
Katie, thank you so much for that. Shall we show our appreciation again?